The old church stood alone in the middle of the Mississippi woods, forgotten by time but not by the spirits that lingered within. Its wooden walls were cracked and weathered, the once white paint now a sickly shade of gray, peeling away like dead skin. The stained glass windows, once vibrant with images of saints and angels, were now covered in thick layers of dust, their colors muted, their figures barely visible. No one had stepped inside for years, yet every Sunday night, the church bell rang, deep and mournful, its sound carrying through the trees, echoing down the empty roads. The people of the nearby town always locked their doors when they heard it, whispering prayers under their breath. They never spoke of the church out loud, never mentioned the strange occurrences, and certainly never dared to go near. They knew the stories, the warnings passed down through generations. The church was still in use, but not by the living. Long ago, the church had been a place of worship for a small, devoted congregation. Families gathered every Sunday, dressed in their best clothes, their voices rising in hymns that filled the wooden hall with warmth and devotion. But one fateful night, everything changed. A great fire broke out during an evening service, consuming the building in an inferno of roaring flames and thick, choking smoke. The fire spread so quickly that no one had time to escape. The doors, once welcoming, were now sealed shut, as if by an unseen force. The townspeople heard the screams, horrible, desperate cries that carried through the night. But by the time they arrived, there was nothing left to save. The fire burned out as suddenly as it had started, leaving only ashes and blackened wood. Yet, strangely, the structure itself remained standing, untouched by the destruction. The bodies of the congregation were never found, as if they had been swallowed by the church itself. Since that night, the spirits of those who perished never left, trapped within the walls, forever doomed to repeat their final service. One stormy night, a young man named Daniel arrived in town. He was a traveler, drawn to the mysteries of forgotten places, always seeking out the stories that others feared to tell. When he heard the tale of the haunted church, he was intrigued, rather than afraid. The warnings of the townspeople only fueled his curiosity, making him eager to witness the legend with his own eyes. Armed with nothing but a lantern and an old camera, he made his way through the dense trees, following the faint outline of an overgrown path. The deeper he went, the colder the air became, an unnatural chill settling into his bones. By the time he reached the churchyard, the night had fallen into a suffocating silence. The usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves had vanished, leaving only the soft creak of the church's wooden beams shifting in the wind. As Daniel stepped onto the front steps, the wind stopped entirely, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Taking a deep breath, Daniel pushed open the heavy wooden doors. They groaned on their rusted hinges, revealing the dark, musty interior. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and something else, something faintly burned. Dust floated, lazily in the dim light of his lantern, catching on the edges of the broken pews that lined the nave. Yet, despite the decay, everything looked strangely undisturbed, as if the congregation had only just left. At the far end of the hall, the pulpit stood in eerie candlelight, though no candles had been lit. The moment Daniel stepped inside, the doors behind him slammed shut with a deafening bang, sending a shiver down his spine. Then, the bell in the tower let out a single, heavy toll vibrating through the floor beneath his feet. His breath came fast and shallow, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He turned toward the door, intending to leave immediately. But when he reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. It was as if the wood itself had fused together. A soft whisper drifted through the air, so quiet he almost thought he imagined it. Then another, and another. Soon the entire room was filled with hushed voices, speaking in low, unintelligible murmurs. Daniel lifted his lantern higher, his pulse racing. The pews were no longer empty. Seated in perfect rows were figures, dozens of them, their heads bowed, their hands folded in their laps. They were dressed in old-fashioned Sunday best, but their clothes were scorched and torn, their skin pale and translucent. Their eyes, when they lifted them, were nothing but dark, empty pits. A wave of nausea rolled over Daniel as he realized what he was seeing. These were the lost souls of the congregation, forever trapped in the church where they had died. His instinct screamed at him to run, but his feet refused to move. At the pulpit, a priest stood, his skeletal hands clutching a worn, blackened Bible. His face was gaunt, his hollow eye sockets locked onto Daniel with a gaze that burned straight through him. The priest's voice was raspy and broken as he spoke, the words foreign and ancient, carrying a power that made Daniel's skin crawl. As the whispers of the congregation grew louder, their voices merged into a rhythmic chant, echoing from all directions. The walls seemed to shift, the shadows stretching unnaturally. Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps as he felt a crushing weight pressing down on his chest. It was as if the church itself was reaching for him, pulling him deeper into its grasp. The priest raised one skeletal hand, and suddenly the air turned freezing. The temperature plummeted so fast that frost formed along the edges of the pews. Daniel's breath came out in visible puffs, his fingers numbing even as he clenched them into fists. The chanting grew louder, the sound vibrating in his skull, making his vision blur. The shadows along the walls twisted and moved, creeping toward him with unnatural fluidity. The pressure in his chest grew unbearable, and he realized with growing horror that he couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, his body no longer his own. The priest took a step forward, extending his hand toward Daniel. The moment those skeletal fingers touched his forehead, pain unlike anything he had ever known ripped through his body. With a desperate cry, Daniel fought against the invisible grip holding him in place. He forced himself to move, inch by inch, toward the door. The congregation rose from their seats, their ghostly forms flickering like candle flames, their mouths still moving in silent prayer. The priest took another step, his fingers still outstretched. Daniel could feel his strength fading, his vision darkening at the edges. With one final surge of desperation, he threw himself at the door, slamming into it with all his weight. This time, it gave way. He stumbled outside, falling to his knees in the damp grass, gasping for air. The wind howled through the trees, and the church behind him seemed to shudder as if in fury. The bell let out one last, sorrowful toll before everything went silent. Once more, Daniel turned, expecting to see the congregation standing in the doorway watching him. But the church was empty again. The candlelight had vanished. The pews were bare. It looked as abandoned as it had always been. But Daniel knew better. He had seen them. He had felt them. And he knew that they were still there, waiting. Daniel ran back to town, his mind reeling, his hands still shaking. The townspeople saw the terror in his eyes and said nothing. They knew the truth. They had seen others return the same way. Some never returned at all. The next morning, Daniel packed his bags and left, vowing never to return. But every Sunday night, without fail, the bell still rang. The congregation still gathered, and the church still waited, hungry for the next soul foolish enough to step inside.